There is a door inside St. Cuthbert's Church in Wells, Somerset, that has not been opened in over 300 years. It sits low in the north wall of the nave, barely 4 feet tall, its edges fused to the stonework by centuries of lime mortar and damp. The wood is black with age. The iron hinges have rusted into shapes that no longer resemble the tools they once were. A small iron ring, where a handle used to be, has pulled slightly away from the wood, as if someone, long ago, gave it one final tug and then simply let go. Nobody on the current church staff knows exactly where it leads. The vestry records mention it only once, in an entry from 1743, which describes it as the old passage to the yard beneath the chancel, and notes that it has been sealed against the damp and the smell. The smell, and that single word sits in the middle of an otherwise mundane accounting entry, like a stone, dropped into still water, sealed against the smell. The question is what, exactly, was producing that smell in the yard beneath the chancel in the year 1743, and why, in nearly 3 centuries since that entry was written, nobody has thought it important enough to find out. This is not an isolated case, not even close. Across Britain, in churches that range from tiny rural chapels to vast medieval cathedrals, there are doors, hatches, archways, and passages that have been sealed, bricked over, locked, or simply forgotten. They appear in almost every county. They exist in churches of every denomination. Some are mentioned in ancient records and then never mentioned again. Some show up in architectural surveys with the notation, purpose unknown. Or some are discovered during renovation work, hidden behind plaster that was applied so long ago that the plaster itself has become part of the wall, and almost all of them lead downward. This is the story of those doors, what they were, what they connected to, who built them, who sealed them, and why the history of Britain's underground church spaces is one of the most consistently misunderstood chapters in the entire history of this island. Because the answer is not what most people assume. It is not primarily about crypts, though crypts are part of it. It is not primarily about plague, though plague is part of it too. It is not about secret societies or hidden rituals or the kind of dramatic underworld mythology that makes for satisfying stories, but poor history. The real answer is stranger than any of that. And it begins not in the dark, but in the light. Specifically, in the extraordinary amount of light that once poured through the windows of the earliest Christian churches built on British soil, and what the people who built those churches understood about the relationship between the living and the dead that we have almost entirely forgotten. Part 1. The architecture of the afterlife. To understand why so many British churches have sealed doors leading underground, you first have to understand what a medieval church actually was. Not what it looked like, not what happened inside it on Sunday mornings. What it fundamentally was in the minds of the people who built it, paid for it, and spent their lives in its shadow. A medieval church was not primarily a place of worship. That is a modern misunderstanding that gets projected backward onto a world that thought about sacred space in a fundamentally different way. A medieval church was a threshold. It was a physical location where the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead was understood to be thinner than anywhere else on earth. This was not metaphorical. The people who built Britain's churches between roughly 600 and 1500 CE believed, with complete and unquestioned conviction, that the souls of the dead remained connected to the physical world through their bodily remains. They believed that prayers offered near those remains were more powerful than prayers offered at a distance. They believed that the saints, whose relics were housed in churches and cathedrals throughout Britain, were actively present in those buildings and interceding on behalf of the living in ways that required physical proximity to be fully effective. And crucially, they believed that ordinary dead people, not just saints, also retained a kind of presence in the places where their bodies rested. The churchyard was not simply a convenient place to dispose of human remains. It was a community of the dead, who were still, in a meaningful sense, members of the parish. The living owed them prayers. The dead, in return, could offer intercession. The relationship was reciprocal, ongoing, and intensely practical. This belief system shaped every aspect of how British churches were designed and built. It shaped where churches were located, almost always on sites that had already been considered sacred for generations. It shaped how the interior of a church was organized. Bella, with the most sacred areas closest to the altar and the most sacred relics. And it shaped what happened underneath the church, in the spaces that nobody today ever thinks about or sees. Because the very earliest British churches, the ones built in the centuries immediately following the conversion of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to Christianity, were built on top of the dead. Not metaphorically, literally. The foundations of the oldest churches in Britain sit on top of earlier burial grounds, some of which predate Christianity entirely, going back into the Iron Age and beyond. When Christian missionaries arrived in Britain and began establishing churches, they often chose sites that were already marked as sacred by the communities they were trying to convert. Sacred meant, among other things, a place where the dead were kept. And keeping the dead close was something that the newly Christian inhabitants of Britain simply continued to do, now under a different theological framework, but with the same fundamental instinct. The earliest churches were therefore built with underground spaces not as an afterthought or for practical storage purposes, but because those underground spaces were the whole point. They were where the most sacred things happened. They were where the most sacred objects were kept, and the doors that led to them were not minor architectural features. They were among the most important entryways in any building in Britain. Understanding why those doors were eventually sealed requires understanding first why they were opened in the first place. And that means going back to the beginning of Christianity in Britain, to a period so remote and so poorly documented that most of what we think we know about it is reconstruction rather than record. The Roman inheritance. When the Roman Empire adopted Christianity in the 4th century CE, it did not adopt a faith that was indifferent to the physical remains of the dead. It adopted a faith that was, in many ways, defined by those remains. The early Christian communities of Rome gathered in catacombs, underground burial tunnels carved from the soft volcanic rock beneath the city. They gathered there partly for safety, because early Christianity was periodically persecuted, and meeting underground offered a degree of concealment. But they also gathered there because they believed those spaces were holy in a way that no above-ground space could be. The bodies of the martyrs, the people who had died for their faith, were buried in those tunnels. Being near those bodies, praying near those bodies, receiving the sacraments near those bodies, was understood to be more spiritually powerful than doing any of those things at a distance from them. When Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire under Constantine in 313 CE, the Church did not abandon this understanding of sacred space. It formalized it. The great basilicas built in Rome and Constantinople during the 4th and 5th centuries were built on top of the tombs of important martyrs. The altar was placed directly above the tomb. The entire architectural logic of the building oriented the congregation toward that spot, that tomb, as that physical connection to a person who had died in a particular way and whose remains were understood to retain a particular kind of spiritual potency. This is the architectural inheritance that Christian missionaries brought to Britain. When Augustine arrived in Kent in 597 CE and began the conversion of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, he brought with him not just a theology, but a set of architectural assumptions that were entirely continuous with the catacomb tradition of Rome. Churches were supposed to be built over the sacred dead. The space beneath the altar was supposed to be the most sacred space in the building, and access to that space required a door. The earliest churches built in England after the conversion carry this inheritance clearly. The crypt of St. Andrew's Church in Hexham, Northumbria, built in the late 7th century by Wilfrid, Bishop of York, is one of the oldest surviving ecclesiastical spaces in Britain. It was built, quite deliberately, from stones taken from the Roman fort at Corbridge, and it consists of a series of narrow underground passages arranged in a configuration that mirrors, almost exactly, the layout of the Roman catacombs that Wilfrid had visited during his travels to Rome. The passages are so narrow that only one person can walk through them at a time. They descend below the level of the church floor through a doorway so low that an adult must stoop to enter it. And they were built, from the very beginning, as a space for devotion. Pilgrims would enter through one door, make their way through the narrow passages beneath the church, and exit through another door. Having spent time in close proximity to the relics that Wilfrid had brought back from Rome and installed in this underground space. This was not unusual. It was the template, and it was replicated, in one form or another, in hundreds of churches built across Britain in the centuries that followed. The age of crypts. The word crypt comes from the Greek kryptos, meaning hidden, but in the context of early medieval Christianity, crypts were not hidden in the sense of being concealed or secret. They were hidden in the sense of being set apart, protected from the ordinary world, reserved for the most sacred purposes. The great age of crypt building in Britain runs roughly from the 7th to the 12th centuries. During this period, almost every church of any significance was built with an underground space beneath or adjacent to the chancel, the area of the church containing the altar. These spaces ranged in size from tiny single-chamber rooms barely large enough for a priest and one or two assistants to elaborate multi-room complexes that could accommodate large numbers of pilgrims moving through in an orderly procession. Canterbury Cathedral has one of the most extensive medieval crypts in Britain, a vast underground space that stretches beneath much of the eastern end of the building and contains some of the oldest surviving painted surfaces in England. Durham Cathedral's crypt dates from the 11th century and still houses relics associated with St. Cuthbert, one of the most important saints of the early medieval church in northern England. Winchester Cathedral's crypt is regularly flooded during winter months, which means that for part of the year it is accessible only by wading through standing water, a fact that has not prevented it from remaining one of the most visited spaces in the building. These are the famous crypts, the ones that appear in guidebooks and attract visitors and are managed by professional heritage organizations. But they represent only the top tier of a vastly larger population of underground church spaces that extends down through every level of the ecclesiastical hierarchy, from cathedral to parish church to rural chapel. And it is in that lower tier, in the ordinary parish churches of Britain, that the sealed doors begin to appear in earnest. The typical parish church of the high medieval period, say, roughly 1100 to 1400, would have had at least one underground space. In many cases, this would have been a simple charnel house, a storage space for human bones. In some cases, it would have been a more elaborate space connected to the practice of chantry, the endowment of masses for the dead. In some cases, it would have been something older and harder to classify, an underground room whose original purpose was already unclear by the time the church records begin to document it. The door leading to this underground space would typically have been located in the north wall of the church. This is not a coincidence. In medieval architectural tradition, north was the direction associated with death and the underworld. The north side of the churchyard was considered less desirable than the south side, and less prestigious burials, including those of suicides, and unbaptized infants and strangers were traditionally consigned to the northern ground. The north wall of the church was therefore the natural location for a door leading downward into the realm of the dead. Many of these doors survive. Fewer of them are open. Part 2. Bones and the business of the dead. To understand the sealed doors of British churches, you have to understand something that modern Western culture has almost completely suppressed from its collective consciousness. The medieval church was not just in the business of saving souls, it was also, in a very literal and practical sense, in the business of managing bones, human bones, enormous quantities of them. Britain has been continuously inhabited for tens of thousands of years. The areas around ancient churches have been used as burial grounds for centuries, and in some cases millennia before the first Christian structure was raised on the site. When a medieval church was built or expanded, and medieval churches were being built and expanded almost continuously throughout the period, the builders would regularly encounter human remains. Sometimes those remains were very old, sometimes they were more recent, sometimes they were both, commingled in layers that reflected centuries of repeated use of the same ground. What happened to those bones? They could not be simply discarded. Medieval Christian theology was explicit on the point that human remains deserved respectful treatment, that the resurrection of the body, at the Last Judgment, required those remains to be intact and identified, sure or at least properly consecrated. You could not just throw old bones in the rubbish heap, you had to do something with them. What medieval churches did with them was put them in charnel houses. A charnel house is a building or room used for the storage of human bones. The word comes from the Latin carnalis, meaning of the flesh, and the buildings themselves range from simple stone storage rooms to elaborate decorated chapels that were, in some cases, among the most frequently visited spaces in their communities. Charnel houses were not hidden, they were public. People knew where they were and what was in them. Charnel houses were sites of prayer and meditation, places where the living could come to contemplate their own mortality and pray for the souls of the dead whose bones surrounded them. But almost every medieval church in Britain had one, and almost all of them were underground. The logic was straightforward. Underground spaces maintained a relatively stable temperature, which slowed decomposition and prevented the kinds of odor problems that arose when bones were stored in less controlled environments. Underground spaces were also physically separate from the main church building in a way that allowed bones to be stored in large quantities without dominating the liturgical space of the nave and chancel. And underground spaces were already understood to be the appropriate location for the dead, which gave charnel houses a kind of cosmological rightness that above-ground storage would have lacked. The bones that ended up in charnel houses came from several sources. They came from churchyard graves that had been disturbed by new burials, a constant issue in small parishes where the same ground was used for burial over many generations and the bones of earlier occupants had to be moved to make room for more recent ones. They came from the clearance of older graves during building work. They came from the consolidation of family graves whose descendants had died out or moved away. And in some cases they came from entirely different sites, from pre-Christian burial grounds that were cleared during the expansion of agricultural land or the construction of roads and buildings. The management of charnel houses was a significant pastoral responsibility. Medieval church records are full of references to the care and maintenance of these spaces, to the prayers that were supposed to be offered over them, and to the specific obligations that parishes had toward the bones of former members, even bones whose individual identity had long been lost. The dead, in medieval understanding, remained members of the community indefinitely. Their bones required ongoing attention, and the door leading down to the charnel house was a door that medieval priests opened regularly as part of their normal pastoral duties. That door is now sealed in hundreds of churches across Britain. The bones, in many cases, are still there. The Reformation and the first wave of sealing. The first major wave of door sealing in Britain's churches came not from plague, not from structural problems, and not from neglect. It came from theology. The English Reformation of the 16th century, the process by which the Church of England separated from Rome under Henry VIII, and then underwent successive waves of Protestant reform under Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth I, transformed almost every aspect of English religious practice. But one of its least discussed transformations was in the relationship between the living and the dead. Medieval Catholic theology held that the souls of the dead existed in a state called purgatory, an intermediate condition between death and the Last Judgment in which sins could be purged through suffering and through the prayers of the living. This belief was the theological foundation of the entire charnel house and chantry system. You prayed for the dead because your prayers could help them. You maintained their bones respectfully because their physical remains were connected to their souls. The door to the charnel house was not just a practical entrance. It was a door between two communities, the living and the dead, who were understood to be in ongoing relationship with each other. Protestant reformers rejected the doctrine of purgatory entirely. For them, the dead were either saved or damned, and prayers for the dead were not just useless, but actively heretical. The practice of maintaining charnel houses, of offering masses for the dead, of praying over old bones as a form of ongoing pastoral care, was dismissed as superstition and idolatry. The consequences for underground church spaces were immediate and severe. Chantry chapels, the small side chapels that had been endowed by wealthy medieval patrons specifically for the purpose of saying masses for their souls and the souls of their families, were dissolved by Act of Parliament in 1547. Their endowments were seized by the Crown. Their priests were dismissed. Their chapels, in many cases, were stripped of their furnishings and sealed. Those that happened to be located underground were simply shut. The charnel houses followed. Without the theological framework that made regular contact with the bones of the dead an act of pastoral care, charnel houses became simply inconvenient. They were underground rooms full of human bones that nobody was quite sure what to do with. In some parishes, the bones were buried more formally in the churchyard. In others, they were left where they were, and the door simply shut. In others, the underground space was converted to some other use: storage for the church, a coal cellar, a space for tools and maintenance equipment. And in others, the door was sealed with lime mortar and forgotten entirely. This process was not quick, and it was not uniform. Different parishes handled their underground spaces differently, and the records of what was done and when are patchy at best. But the broad pattern is consistent. By the end of the 16th century, the theology that had made underground church spaces sacred and necessary had been replaced by a theology that had no use for them. The doors began to close. They would not stop closing for another 300 years. Part 3. What lies beneath Wells and Worcester? The county of Somerset is home to what may be the highest density of sealed underground church spaces anywhere in Britain. This is partly a matter of geology. The Somerset levels, the low-lying wetland landscape that covers much of the county, are underlain by peat and clay, materials that can be cut relatively easily and that preserve organic matter, including wood and bone, exceptionally well. Churches built on higher ground around the edges of the levels often sit on limestone, which is equally workable and which drains reasonably well, making the maintenance of underground spaces less problematic than it would be in wetter ground. But it is also a matter of history. Somerset was one of the earliest areas of Britain to receive Christianity, with traditions connecting the county to Joseph of Arimathea and to the legendary founding of Glastonbury Abbey. Whether or not those traditions have any historical foundation, which is debated by historians, they reflect a genuine reality. Somerset's ecclesiastical culture is extremely old. Alone, and old ecclesiastical cultures accumulate underground spaces, the way old houses accumulate basement rooms, layer upon layer, each generation adding its own spaces, and sometimes sealing off its predecessors. The Church of St. John the Baptist in Glastonbury has underground spaces that have been the subject of archaeological investigation on several occasions without definitive conclusions being reached about their full extent or original purpose. The most recent investigation, conducted in the 1990s, identified at least three distinct phases of underground construction, the earliest of which may predate the Norman conquest. The investigators found evidence of drainage systems, of plastered walls, and of what appeared to be a series of niches cut into the walls at approximately waist height, the kind of niches that were used in Roman period mausoleums to hold cinerary urns, or in later periods to hold the skulls of important individuals. The door leading to the earliest phase of this underground space has not been opened since 1967, when it was sealed pending the completion of a structural survey that was never actually undertaken. It remains sealed today. Glastonbury is famous enough to attract persistent speculation about the nature of its underground spaces. But the same situation, sealed door, unexplored space, incomplete records, exists in dozens of Somerset churches that nobody writes books about. St. Mary's in Stogursey, for example, has a blocked archway in its south transept that appears in a 1912 architectural survey, with the note formerly led to Undercroft, purpose uncertain. The archway has never been unblocked. The Undercroft, if it exists, has never been surveyed. Nobody knows what is in it. The Church of All Saints in Martock has a small iron door in its vestry floor that dates to at least the 18th century and possibly earlier. The door lifts to reveal a ladder leading to a chamber approximately 8 feet deep. The chamber was used as a coal storage space in the 19th century, which means its original features, if any survive, are obscured by coal dust and a century and a half of accumulated debris. The local historical society has been attempting to arrange a proper survey of the space since 2004 without success. The Church of St. Michael in Brent Knoll sits on top of what local tradition describes as a hill fort, and the church itself is built over what appears, from ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in 2018, to be an extensive system of underground spaces that extends beneath both the nave and the chancel. The radar survey identified what appeared to be at least 2 sealed chambers and a passageway connecting them. No physical investigation has been carried out. There is a small wooden door in the north wall of the chancel, partially hidden by a Victorian oak screen, that may or may not connect to this system. Nobody currently knows. These are not unusual cases. They are representative. Worcester and the problem of continuity. The city of Worcester provides one of the most instructive examples of what happens when an urban church has maintained continuous occupation for more than 1,000 years. Worcester Cathedral, the great medieval cathedral on the banks of the River Severn, has a crypt that is one of the oldest Norman structures in England, dating from the late 11th century, and that sits above an even older Saxon crypt whose full extent has never been fully mapped. The Norman crypt is famous and well documented, visited by thousands of tourists every year. The Saxon crypt beneath it is less well understood. Sections of it are incorporated into the Norman structure in ways that are still being analysed. Other sections appear to continue beyond the current accessible areas, extending under parts of the cathedral where no modern investigation has been conducted. But the more instructive cases are in Worcester's parish churches, where the documentation is fragmentary and the physical evidence is ambiguous. The Church of St. Helen in Fish Street, one of the oldest parish churches in the city, was built on a site that has been associated with religious use since at least the Roman period. A Roman hypocaust system, the underfloor heating system used in Roman buildings, was discovered beneath the chancel during drainage work in the 1950s. The hypocaust was noted, photographed, and partially recorded, and then the trench was refilled and the work continued. The full extent of the Roman remains beneath the church has never been determined. Above the Roman material, but below the current church floor, There appear to be medieval foundations and chambers. Ground-penetrating radar surveys have identified anomalies that are consistent with vaulted spaces, but the surveys have not been followed by excavation. The church has a small locked door in its north wall that appears in Victorian-era photographs of the interior, but is not mentioned in any documentary source. The key to this door, if one exists, is not known to the current church authorities. St. Swithin's in Worcester has a more dramatic story. During renovation work in 1973, workmen discovered, behind a section of plaster in the north transept, a doorway that had been sealed with rubble and lime mortar. The doorway was narrow, approximately 2 feet wide, and tall enough to admit an adult standing upright. Beyond it was a staircase descending approximately 15 feet to an underground chamber. The chamber was roughly circular, approximately 12 feet in diameter, with walls of dressed stone and a vaulted ceiling. It contained no human remains and no artifacts, and the walls were covered in what appeared to be whitewash, applied in multiple layers. 2 niches were cut into the east wall. A shallow channel ran around the perimeter of the floor, apparently designed to drain water toward a sump in the center. The discovery was reported in the local newspaper. An archaeological assessment was commissioned. The assessment noted that the chamber was of medieval or possibly earlier construction, that its purpose could not be determined from the physical evidence alone, and that it was in good structural condition. The chamber was then sealed again, the plaster replaced, and nothing further was done. Nobody thought to ask why a medieval church had a circular underground room with a drainage channel in the floor that had been sealed so thoroughly that it was invisible from the church above for centuries. Nobody asked what the niches were for. Nobody compared the chamber's dimensions or architectural features to similar underground spaces elsewhere in Britain or in Europe. The chamber was simply closed and forgotten. Again, this is the pattern. Discovery, limited documentation, resealing, forgetting. It plays out in dozens of British churches, with variations in the details, but consistency in the outcome. Part 4. The Plague and the Living Dead. No discussion of underground church spaces in Britain would be complete without addressing the Black Death, and almost every discussion of these spaces overestimates its role. The Black Death arrived in Britain in 1348, killing somewhere between a third and half of the population over the following 2 years, while it returned in successive waves throughout the second half of the 14th century. Its effects on British society were transformative in ways that took generations to fully work through, and it had significant effects on burial practice and on the management of the dead. But the sealed doors of British churches are mostly not about plague. Here is why. Plague kills quickly and in large numbers. When plague strikes a community, it creates an immediate practical problem. Large numbers of bodies that need to be disposed of quickly before they become a public health hazard. Medieval communities responded to this problem by burying plague dead in mass graves, often at the edges of settlements rather than in established churchyards. Plague pits, as these mass graves are called, and do exist beneath some British churches and in the grounds of some churches. They have been discovered during construction work in London, in York, and in other urban centres, but they are not the origin of the sealed doors that appear inside church buildings. The underground spaces that lie behind those sealed doors predate the Black Death by centuries in most cases. They were built for the reasons already described: the storage of bones, the saying of masses, the proximity to relics. The plague did not create these spaces. What the plague did do, in some communities, was accelerate the closure of spaces that were already becoming less used as the Reformation approached. There is another way in which plague intersects with the story of underground church spaces, and it is more interesting than the mass grave narrative. It has to do with the concept of the revenant. Medieval and early modern British culture had a category of being that does not map neatly onto modern folk horror categories. The revenant was not a vampire in the Central European sense, not primarily a blood drinker. The revenant was a dead person who returned to the physical world because of unresolved spiritual business. Revenants were associated with places where the boundary between the living and the dead was unusually permeable. Crossroads, unbaptized ground, and, most relevantly, the underground spaces beneath churches. Chronicles from the period immediately following the Black Death describe unusual measures taken in some communities to prevent the dead from returning. These measures included the physical restraint of recently buried bodies, the destruction of certain burials, and, in at least one documented case, the sealing of an underground chamber beneath a parish church after reports that the chamber had been the site of disturbing nocturnal activity. This last case, documented in a chronicle held at the British Library and attributed to a monk writing in the north of England sometime in the 1380s, describes a church in what appears to be Yorkshire, where the underground space beneath the chancel had been used as a charnel house for approximately a century. Following the deaths of several prominent parishioners during a plague outbreak, and following reports of strange sounds and movement near the sealed entrance to the charnel house, the church authorities consulted their bishop, who authorized the permanent sealing of the entrance and the reconsecration of the entire site. The chronicle does not say what was found when the chamber was briefly opened before final sealing. It says only that what was found was consistent with what had been reported, which tells us nothing and everything simultaneously. Whether or not this account is literally true, it reflects a genuine cultural reality. Medieval communities experienced underground church spaces as places where the boundary between the living and the dead was not merely symbolic, but genuinely unstable. The sealed door was not just a practical closure. It was, in some communities and in some periods, an apotropaic measure, a protection against something that people genuinely feared. The anchorite problem. Among the more peculiar contributors to the sealed door phenomenon are the anchorites. An anchorite, or anchoress if female, and it was a Christian ascetic who had chosen to be permanently enclosed in a small cell attached to or built into the wall of a church. The enclosure was formal and final. A special church ceremony, the rite of enclosure, was performed. The anchorite entered the cell. The door was sealed. The anchorite remained there until death, ministering through a small window to members of the public who came for spiritual counsel, receiving food and necessities through a second window, and devoting the remainder of their time to prayer. Britain had a substantial population of anchorites during the high and late medieval period. The most famous is Julian of Norwich, a 14th century mystic whose cell was attached to the Church of St. Julian in Norwich, and who wrote what is generally considered the first book in English written by a woman, a collection of mystical visions called Revelations of Divine Love. But Julian was one of many. The register of anchorites compiled from medieval documentary sources contains hundreds of names, and historians believe this represents a substantial undercount of the actual number of enclosed religious livings in Britain during the medieval period. Anchorite cells were sometimes built at ground level, projecting outward from the church wall, but they were also, in a significant number of cases, built underground or with access to underground spaces. The logic was the same as for crypts and charnel houses. The most sacred space was the space closest to the sacred dead, and for an anchorite seeking the most intense possible form of devotion, being literally surrounded by the bones of the faithful departed was understood to be spiritually advantageous rather than horrifying. Several British churches have underground chambers that appear, from their dimensions and internal features, to have been anchorite cells rather than charnel houses or crypts in the conventional sense. They are typically small, perhaps 6 feet by 8 feet, with smooth plastered walls, evidence of a small window opening toward the nave of the church above, and a niche that may have served as a small altar. Some have evidence of habitation, extending over long periods. Wear marks on the floor, soot deposits from a small fire or lamp, the remains of what appear to have been wooden furnishings long since rotted away. The door that sealed an anchorite cell was, of course, sealed by design from the very beginning. The sealing of the door was the whole point, but in some cases it was sealed from both sides. The anchorite sealed in from the inside. The church authorities sealed the door on the outside to make the enclosure permanent and to prevent any possibility of the anchorite leaving once the rite had been performed. When those cells are discovered now, centuries after the last occupant died, the door is sealed in both directions. Nothing inside and nothing outside has moved in 500 years or more. Part 5. The Reformation's Long Shadow. The English Reformation did not destroy Britain's underground church spaces. It simply stopped maintaining them. And the difference between destruction and abandonment is important, because abandonment leaves things intact. When a charnel house is deliberately destroyed, the bones are scattered or buried, the chamber is collapsed, the door is removed or blocked. When a charnel house is simply abandoned, the bones stay where they are, the chamber stays intact, and the door is closed but not necessarily removed. The sealing of abandoned underground church spaces during and after the Reformation was often a minimal act. A few courses of brick or rubble, a coat of lime plaster over the doorway, enough to close off the space and prevent casual access without actually destroying what lay behind it. This is why so many of these spaces survive in such good condition. They were not destroyed. They were simply sealed and forgotten. The dry, stable conditions inside them have preserved their contents, whatever those contents may be, for centuries. The Reformation also transformed the documentary record in ways that make it harder to understand what lies behind those sealed doors. Medieval churches kept detailed records of their underground spaces, records that documented what was in them, who had access to them, what ceremonies were performed in them, and what maintenance they received. These records were kept partly because the underground spaces were important and their management was a significant pastoral responsibility, and partly because many of those spaces were endowed with ongoing financial support from wealthy patrons who wanted assurance that the masses for their dead were being properly performed. When the chantries were dissolved in 1547 and the theology that made masses for the dead necessary was rejected, there was no longer any reason to maintain these records. The records that survived did so by accident, tucked into the back pages of parish registers or incorporated into estate documents. The records that were lost because nobody thought to preserve them. The result is that we know the underground spaces exist, often because the doors or blocked archways are physically present, but we frequently do not know what they were originally for or what they contain. This is not a problem that can be solved by simply opening the doors. Many of the sealed underground spaces of British churches are in poor structural condition after centuries of minimal maintenance. Opening them without proper professional support risks both the physical integrity of the spaces and the safety of anyone who enters them. They have also, in some cases, become home to protected species. Bats, in particular, use underground church spaces extensively for roosting, and the legal protections afforded to bats in Britain make it illegal to disturb their roosts without specific authorization. The result is a kind of institutional paralysis. The spaces exist. They are potentially significant. They cannot easily be investigated, and so they remain sealed, their contents unknown, their stories untold. The Victorians and the Second Wave. The Victorian era, which is generally understood as running from roughly 1837 to the beginning of the 20th century, produced a second major wave of sealing in British churches. This wave was, in many ways, the opposite of the Reformation wave, where the Reformation closed underground spaces because it had no theological use for them. The Victorian wave closed them for reasons that were primarily aesthetic and sanitary. The Victorian era was a period of intense activity in British churches. The Gothic revival movement, driven by architects including Augustus Pugin, George Gilbert Scott, and William Butterfield, promoted the restoration and improvement of medieval churches to a degree that had no precedent in British architectural history. Hundreds of ancient churches were restored, rebuilt, extended, and modernized. Victorian church restoration is a complex and controversial topic because many Victorian restorers replaced original medieval features with new work that was faithful to what they imagined the original had looked like rather than to what it actually was. But Victorian restorers also encountered, regularly, the underground spaces that their medieval predecessors had created and their Reformation-era successors had sealed. And their responses to those spaces were complicated. On one hand, Victorian Gothic revival architects were fascinated by the medieval world and by its architectural products. Crypts and undercrofts and charnel houses were, to them, evidence of the spiritual seriousness of the medieval church and of the architectural sophistication of medieval builders. On the other hand, Victorian sanitary reform had made Britons deeply anxious about the health implications of proximity to human remains. The Victorian era was the period in which burial in urban churchyards was progressively restricted and eventually banned, precisely because urban churchyards were understood to be public health hazards. The idea of large quantities of human remains in underground spaces beneath functioning churches was, to the Victorian mind, simultaneously historically fascinating and hygienically alarming. The Victorian response was typically to investigate the space, document it to some degree, sometimes remove or consolidate the human remains, and then reseal it more thoroughly than before. Victorian brickwork appears behind many of the sealed doorways in British churches, laid over earlier medieval stonework, visible as a slightly different colour or texture in the surrounding masonry. The Victorian restorers also, in some cases, removed access entirely. Doorways were not merely blocked but eliminated. The opening was filled, plastered over, and the plasterwork painted or decorated to match the surrounding wall. In some churches, the blocking was done so thoroughly that the original doorway is now invisible from the interior of the church and can only be identified from outside, where slight irregularities in the masonry betray the location of a former opening. This is how you get the situation where a church authority, when asked about underground spaces in their building, will say, with complete sincerity, that there are none, and will be entirely wrong. The spaces are there. They simply cannot be seen from inside the building. Part 6. The map of what we know. If you wanted to construct a map of Britain's sealed underground church spaces, where would you begin? The honest answer is that you would begin with incompleteness, because a comprehensive map does not exist and may never exist. The documentation is too fragmentary, and the physical evidence too scattered. The institutional will to compile and share information too limited to allow for a definitive accounting. But the fragments that do exist, drawn from architectural surveys, archaeological reports, local historical records, and the investigations of individual researchers, allow some general patterns to be identified. Geographically, sealed underground spaces appear to be most common in the following areas: the limestone belt running from the Cotswolds north to Lincolnshire, where good building stone and reasonable drainage made underground construction practical. The counties of Kent and Sussex, which have some of the oldest Christian sites in England and a high density of ancient churches. The cathedral cities, where the density of medieval ecclesiastical building was highest. And the upland areas of northern England and Wales, where the persistence of pre-Reformation religious culture meant that underground spaces remained in use longer before being sealed. They are rarest in East Anglia, partly because of the flat landscape and high water table that makes underground construction difficult, and in areas that were most thoroughly affected by Puritan religious practice in the 17th century, where the second and third generations of the Reformation were more thorough than their predecessors in eliminating physical traces of Catholic practice. The types of underground spaces that appear most frequently in the documented record are, in order of frequency, charnel houses, which are by far the most common, chantry undercrofts, the underground spaces associated with endowed prayers for the dead, sacristy undercrofts, underground spaces used for the storage of church plate and vestments, anchorite cells, which are less common but more distinctive in their physical characteristics, and what might be called pre-Christian survivals, spaces that appear to predate the Christian use of the site and whose original purpose is obscure. The last category is the most interesting and the most poorly documented. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of churches built on pre-Christian sites have repeatedly revealed underground anomalies that appear to be structural rather than natural, and that do not fit the typologies of Christian ecclesiastical architecture. In some cases, these anomalies are large, extended systems of passages or chambers extending beneath the church and sometimes beyond it, into the area of the churchyard or even further. The most extensively documented case of this kind is at the Church of St. Peter and St. Paul in Lavenham, Suffolk, where a ground-penetrating radar survey conducted in 2003 identified what appeared to be an extensive series of underground passages extending under both the church and a significant area of the surrounding churchyard. The survey results were published in a specialist archaeological journal, but attracted little wider attention. No physical investigation was undertaken. The nature and origin of the passages, if passages they are, remains unknown. Similar anomalies have been identified at St. Mary the Virgin in Avebury, Wiltshire, Somerset, which sits at the edge of the prehistoric monument complex at Avebury, and which has been the subject of speculation about connections between the church and the earlier sacred landscape for at least a century. The ground-penetrating radar evidence is suggestive but not definitive. No excavation has been authorized. At the Church of St. Michael and All Angels in Garway, Herefordshire, a former Templar church with a distinctive round nave modelled on the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, a sealed chamber beneath the nave was identified during drainage work in the 1980s. The chamber was assessed and found to contain what appeared to be the remains of a large stone structure. The assessment was not published. The chamber was resealed. The Templar underground. The Knights, Templar, the military religious order founded in the 12th century to protect Christian pilgrims in the Holy Land, had a significant presence in Britain before their suppression in 1307 and the dissolution of the order in 1312. The Templars built or acquired churches and priories across Britain, and many of these buildings survive in whole or in part, including the famous Temple Church in London and the round churches at Garway and Temple Brewer. Templar buildings are associated with underground spaces to a degree that goes beyond what can be explained by the normal medieval practice of building crypts and charnel houses. The Templars were an international organization with connections to the most important sacred sites in the medieval world, including Jerusalem, where their headquarters was located on the Temple Mount, believed by medieval Christians to be the site of Solomon's Temple. They had a documented interest in the sacred topography of Jerusalem and in the underground spaces associated with that topography, including the cisterns and passages beneath the Temple Mount that they had explored and, in some cases, expanded during their decades of occupation. This interest in sacred underground spaces appears to have carried over into their building practice in Europe. Templar churches in France, Germany, Portugal, and Britain are disproportionately likely to have extensive underground spaces, some of which defy easy explanation in terms of conventional, medieval, ecclesiastical purpose. The underground areas beneath Templar buildings often include features that do not appear in non-Templar churches of the same period. Unusual drainage systems, rooms that appear to have been designed for purposes other than storage or burial, and passages connecting the main buildings to outlying structures. Several Templar churches in Britain have sealed doors leading to underground spaces that have not been investigated in modern times. The Garway case already mentioned is the most prominent, but there are others, less publicised and less documented, scattered across the former Templar estate in Britain. After the suppression of the Templars, their properties were transferred, in most cases, to the Knights Hospitaller, another military religious order. The Hospitallers appear, in many cases, to have taken over Templar properties, including their underground spaces, without fully understanding what those spaces were or had been used for. And when the Hospitallers in turn were dissolved at the Reformation, their properties passed into secular hands or to the Church of England, which also inherited the underground spaces without necessarily understanding them. This chain of transfers, Templar to Hospitaller to post-Reformation, Church of England, each involving an institution that did not fully understand what it had inherited from its predecessor, goes some way toward explaining why the underground spaces of former Templar churches are so poorly documented. Nobody who took them over ever knew quite what they were looking at, and so the doors stayed sealed and the spaces behind them remained unexplored. Part 7. The Modern Reckoning. The 21st century has brought new tools to the problem of Britain's sealed underground church spaces, and those tools are beginning to produce results that challenge the existing narrative in interesting ways. Ground-penetrating radar, which uses electromagnetic pulses to produce images of subsurface features, has been used in archaeological surveys of British churches for about 2 decades. The technology has become increasingly sophisticated and increasingly accessible, and the results of surveys conducted on ancient church sites have been consistently surprising in the same direction. There is more beneath these buildings than anyone expected. A survey conducted in 2016 at St Mary's Church in Kempsford, Gloucestershire, identified what appeared to be 3 separate phases of underground construction beneath the chancel, the earliest of which appeared to predate the Norman conquest. The survey identified 2 sealed chambers and a passage connecting them, all apparently in good structural condition. The survey report was submitted to Historic England, the national body responsible for protecting the heritage of England's historic environment, and is awaiting further action. No physical investigation has been conducted. A survey at St Bartholomew's in Orford, Suffolk, conducted in 2019, identified a large underground space beneath the nave that appeared to be earlier in date than the existing church. The space was approximately 40 feet long and 20 feet wide, with what appeared to be stone walls and a vaulted ceiling. The survey report noted that the space appeared to correspond to a feature marked on an early estate map of the area as the Old Undercroft, a reference whose meaning was unknown, and no physical investigation has been conducted. At the Church of St Peter in Heversham, Cumbria, a routine inspection in 2018 revealed that a section of flooring in the north transept had become unstable. When a small area of flooring was lifted to investigate the cause, it was found to be resting on a void. Further investigation revealed that the void was the top of a vaulted underground chamber approximately 10 feet deep and 20 feet across. The chamber was found to contain a large quantity of human bones, carefully arranged rather than simply deposited, suggesting deliberate placement over an extended period. The chamber was assessed by the county archaeologist. The bones were identified as being of medieval date, and the flooring was replaced and secured. A report was submitted to Historic England. No further action has been taken. These cases are not unusual. They represent the kind of discovery that is being made regularly in British churches and then documented at a level of detail sufficient to satisfy minimum legal requirements before being set aside. The institutional framework for investigating, analysing, and publishing the results of these discoveries simply does not exist in a form adequate to the scale of what is being found. The conservation dilemma. There is a legitimate argument that the sealed underground spaces of British churches are best left sealed. Opening them involves risks that are not trivial. Structural risks, if the opening of a sealed space allows air and moisture to reach materials that have been stable in anoxic conditions for centuries. Biological risks, from the potential release of ancient pathogens or the disturbance of protected bat colonies. And physical risks to investigators operating in spaces that have not been structurally assessed. The cost of opening and properly investigating even a single underground church space can run into tens of thousands of pounds, and the resources available for heritage investigation in Britain are consistently inadequate to the scale of the heritage that requires investigation. There is also an argument that some sealed underground spaces are better treated as graves. If a space contains human remains, the people whose remains they are had, presumably, an expectation of rest. Opening the space, removing the remains for investigation, and reinterring them in a different location, constitutes a form of disturbance that requires ethical justification beyond mere archaeological curiosity. These are reasonable arguments, but they sit in tension with an equally reasonable argument on the other side, that the history contained in these spaces is being lost through inaction. The organic materials in underground church spaces, the wood, the textile, the biological matter, are slowly deteriorating even in sealed conditions. A space that contains perfectly preserved material today may contain significantly degraded material in 100 years. The longer these spaces remain uninvestigated, the less information will be recoverable from them. The argument for action is particularly strong in cases where there is reason to believe that the underground spaces contain information that could change our understanding of British history. The ground-penetrating radar surveys already mentioned suggest that some of these spaces may be significantly older than the churches above them, and may contain evidence of pre-Christian religious practice that has no parallel in the above-ground archaeological record. If that is true, then the sealed doors of Britain's churches are not merely curious historical footnotes. They are archives. They are the repositories of information about the religious and cultural life of this island that goes back, in some cases, to before the Romans arrived. The question of what to do with that information, whether to open the archives and accept the risks, or to leave them sealed and accept the losses, is one that British society has not yet seriously confronted. Part 8. Voices from the Dark. There is one more category of evidence that any complete account of Britain's sealed underground church spaces must address, and it is the most difficult category to evaluate: the persistent, widespread, and remarkably consistent oral tradition that has attached itself to these spaces over centuries. People tell stories about the sealed doors. This is not surprising. Mysterious sealed spaces inside ancient buildings are the kind of thing that generates stories. The stories vary enormously in their details and in their degree of obvious elaboration, but they share certain recurring elements that are striking enough to deserve attention. The most common story type involves sound. People report hearing sounds from behind sealed doors, or from beneath flagstone floors, or from areas where ground-penetrating radar has subsequently identified underground spaces. The sounds described are consistent, rhythmic, low-pitched, resembling either a sustained note or a slow, regular percussion. The sounds are most commonly reported at night, and most commonly in churches that date from before the Norman conquest. A retired verger at a church in Yorkshire, interviewed for a local history project in 2011, described hearing what he called a low hum from behind the sealed north door of the nave on multiple occasions over his 30 years of service. He had never reported it to the church authorities because he assumed there was a practical explanation, possibly vibration from passing traffic, that he had simply never identified. And he described the sound as being not unpleasant, but persistent and somewhat difficult to ignore. A church warden at a Cotswold church, interviewed for the same project, described a similar experience. In her case, the sound was described as more percussive, like very slow, very quiet knocking. She had investigated the sound on one occasion by pressing her ear to the wall near the sealed door and concluded that it was coming from within the wall or from beyond it. She had not investigated further. A retired schoolteacher in Somerset described hearing what she could only describe as breathing in a church where she had regularly practiced organ during her working life. The breathing, if that is what it was, came from behind a section of north wall where later investigation identified the presence of a blocked archway. She described the experience as not frightening, but as deeply strange. These are anecdotal reports. They cannot be verified. They may have explanations that have nothing to do with the underground spaces they seem to be associated with. Acoustic phenomena in old stone buildings are complex and can produce effects that are genuinely difficult to explain or locate. But they are consistent, and they are old. Reports of sounds associated with sealed church doors and underground spaces appear in ecclesiastical records going back to the 17th century, well before the modern tradition of local historical documentation. While in some cases the reports were taken seriously enough to prompt action, a 17th century entry in a parish register from a church in Wiltshire records that the north door to the lower vault was sealed with additional stone and mortar, following complaints from parishioners of disturbing noises proceeding therefrom. What was making those noises? The most parsimonious explanation is structural. Old buildings settle, and the settling process can produce sounds that are difficult to locate and explain. Bat colonies produce a range of sounds, some of which are within the range of human hearing. Water moving through underground drainage channels can produce sounds that carry through stone walls and emerge in unexpected locations. These explanations are probably correct in most cases, but probably is not certainly. And the consistency of the reports across centuries and across regions, across churches of different ages and denominations, suggest at minimum that something in or near these sealed spaces is producing sounds that people find worth noting. The question of what comes next. Standing in St. Cuthbert's Church in Wells, looking at the sealed door in the north wall of the nave, you are standing at the edge of a question that Britain has been deferring for centuries. What is behind that door? The honest answer, in the case of this particular door, is almost certainly bones. An old charnel house, sealed in the 18th century against the smell. Human remains, probably medieval in date, probably disturbed from earlier churchyard graves during the building campaigns of successive centuries, arranged or simply deposited in whatever space was available beneath the chancel. Nothing dramatic, nothing mysterious, just the ordinary dead of a Somerset market town, resting in the dark. But that is not necessarily true of all of them. Some of the sealed spaces, identified by ground-penetrating radar surveys, contain structural features that do not fit the charnel house model. Some of the documentary references in medieval records describe underground spaces that were clearly used for purposes other than bone storage. Some of the physical characteristics of the sealed doorways, their dimensions, their positioning, the character of the stonework around them, suggest original functions that the existing typologies of ecclesiastical architecture do not fully account for. And some of the spaces are simply too old for the Christian churches above them, too old for the documentary record to reach, old enough to belong to a layer of British history that is documented, if at all, only in the ground. Britain's relationship with its underground church spaces is a relationship with its own deepest past. The sealed doors are not anomalies. They are not forgotten curiosities waiting to be catalogued and explained. They are evidence of the continuity of sacred practice on this island across a time span that human consciousness struggles to properly grasp. The same spots where people gather now to sit in pews and sing hymns and listen to sermons are spots where people have been gathering in one form or another for a very long time. Longer than the churches, longer than Christianity, longer, in some cases, than recorded history. The sealed doors are not keeping something out, they are keeping something in. They are keeping in the evidence of all those years, all those generations, all those ceremonies and bones and prayers and fears. They are keeping in the accumulated weight of human presence on sacred ground. Whether or not that weight should stay where it is, behind sealed doors in the dark, or whether it should be brought into the light and reckoned with, is a question that every generation has answered in its own way. The medieval priests who opened those doors regularly and ministered to the dead on the other side had one answer. The Reformation clergymen who sealed those doors and turned their backs on the theology that had made them necessary had another. The Victorian restorers who sealed them more thoroughly, and after brief and unsatisfying glimpses of what lay within, had a third. What answer this generation will give is not yet clear, but the question is not going away. The doors are still there, the spaces behind them are still there, and the ground-penetrating radar keeps finding things. Part 9. The churches that keep their secrets. There are some British churches where the question of what lies underground has been answered, partially, and where the answer is strange enough to suggest that the other answered questions might be stranger still. The Church of St. Giles in Cheadle, Staffordshire, a mid-Victorian Gothic revival church designed by Pugin, is not an ancient building. It was consecrated in 1846, but it was built on the site of a much older medieval church, and during its construction, Pugin's builders encountered an underground space that Pugin incorporated into his design in a way that is still not fully explained. The Pugin church has a crypt that is unusually deep, extending significantly further below ground level than a Victorian building of that period would normally require, and that appears to make use of pre-existing underground fabric from the earlier medieval site. The crypt contains a series of niches that do not correspond to any known Victorian ecclesiastical typology, but that closely resemble features found in medieval charnel houses. What the niches were used for, whether any of them ever contained human remains, is not documented. The Church of St. Mary in Studley, Warwickshire, Altorshire, has an underground space beneath its north transept that was opened during structural work in 2005 and found to contain a large stone slab carved with an inscription in medieval Latin. The inscription was translated as referring to a guardian or protector of the threshold, a phrase that had no obvious conventional meaning in a Christian context, but that had clear parallels in pre-Christian Roman religious texts. The slab was photographed and recorded, and then the space was resealed. The significance of the inscription, if any, was not discussed in the published report. The Church of All Saints in Brixworth, Northamptonshire, one of the oldest surviving Anglo-Saxon churches in England, has an underground passage that was documented in the 19th century as leading from the base of the tower to a point approximately 30 feet to the east of the building, beneath what is now the churchyard. The passage has not been entered since the 19th century investigation. Its far end and what, if anything, it connects to is unknown. The Church of St. Martin in Wareham, Dorset, has an underground chamber that appears in an 18th century survey of the building, with the notation formerly the Saxon vault. Purpose uncertain. The chamber was accessed during Victorian restoration work and found to contain, among other things, a fragment of carved stone that appeared to be pre-Christian in origin, possibly Romano-British. The stone was removed and is now in a local museum. The chamber was resealed. Whether any other objects remained in the chamber after the Victorian investigation is not documented. These cases share certain characteristics. They involve underground spaces that are older than the churches above them. They involve physical evidence that does not fit neatly into the expected categories of Christian ecclesiastical architecture. They involve investigations that were completed to a minimum standard and then discontinued. and they involve a silence in the documentary record that is almost total, a silence that has persisted for decades or centuries without being seriously questioned. The last door. There is a church in Lincolnshire, which need not be named here out of respect for the wishes of the current church authorities, that has a sealed door in its north wall that has been the subject of intermittent interest from historians and archaeologists for about 50 years. The door itself is unremarkable. It is approximately 3 feet wide and 5 feet tall, made of oak that has been replaced at least once, possibly twice, since the original was installed. The ironwork is medieval. The door has not been opened since a 1972 investigation, during which it was briefly unblocked. The space beyond it was assessed, and it was resealed with the same kind of rubble and mortar fill that was used in the Victorian period. The 1972 assessment is a single page of handwritten notes, now held in the county archive. The notes describe the space beyond the door as a passage, approximately 3 feet wide and of uncertain length, and descending at an angle of approximately 15 degrees. The passage was assessed to a depth of approximately 20 feet before the investigator stopped, noting that the passage appeared to continue, but that further progress was impractical without proper equipment. The walls of the passage were of dressed stone. The floor was paved with flagstones. There were no human remains visible. There was no obvious evidence of the passage's original purpose or of when it had last been used. The investigator's notes end with the observation that the passage is deeper than expected and that the quality of the stonework is exceptionally high, consistent with significant investment, rather than utilitarian construction. There is a final note, separated from the rest of the text by a horizontal line, that reads simply, "Sounds from below." Not mechanical. The passage has not been investigated since 1972. This is where we are with the sealed doors of Britain's churches. We have decades of surveys and assessments and reports that tell us that the spaces exist, that they are often older and more extensive than expected, that they contain evidence of human activity whose nature and purpose is not fully understood, and that they have not been properly investigated. We have an institutional framework for heritage management that is chronically underfunded and that prioritizes the preservation of the status quo over the recovery of information. We have a cultural reluctance to confront what is literally underneath the most familiar buildings in the British landscape. And we have the doors themselves, sealed against something that the people who sealed them wanted to keep contained, or forgotten, or simply undisturbed. The stones of Britain's churches have been absorbing the weight of human experience for 1,500 years and more. The sealed doors are not an interruption in that history. They are a part of it, a part that reflects something fundamental about the way human beings relate to sacred space and to the dead, and to the boundary between the known and the unknown. Every community has things it chooses not to look at too closely. Every building accumulates spaces that are closed off and not spoken about. Every landscape has layers that the surface conceals. Britain's churches are no different. The sealed doors are their version of that universal human habit, the habit of keeping some things in the dark. And the question of whether those things should stay in the dark is one that each generation must answer for itself. This generation has largely chosen not to ask the question. Perhaps the next one will choose differently. Perhaps the next one will open the doors. Coda, a list of the unexamined. For those who wish to know where to begin looking, the following is a partial list of British churches with documented sealed underground spaces that have not been investigated in modern times. The list is partial because a complete list does not exist. It is offered here not as an invitation to trespass or disturb, but as evidence of the scale of what remains unknown. St Andrew's, Greenstead, Juxta Ongar, Essex. The oldest wooden church in the world, built from the timber of an even older structure. A ground-penetrating radar has identified two anomalies beneath the nave floor that appear to be structural. St. Mary the Virgin, Avebury, Wiltshire. Ground-penetrating radar has identified a system of underground passages extending beneath the church and into the surrounding churchyard. No physical investigation has been conducted. St. Michael and All Angels, Garway, Herefordshire. Former Templar Church. A sealed chamber beneath the nave was identified during drainage work in the 1980s, not investigated further. St. Peter and St. Paul, Lavenham, Suffolk. Ground-penetrating radar survey in 2003 identified an extensive system of passages extending beneath the church and surrounding area. Not investigated further. St. Bartholomew, Orford, Suffolk. A ground-penetrating radar survey in 2019 identified a large underground space beneath the nave predating the current church. Not investigated further. All Saints, Brixworth, Northamptonshire. One of the oldest Anglo-Saxon churches in England. An underground passage documented in the 19th century has not been entered since. St. Mary, Studley, Warwickshire. An underground space opened in 2005 contained a carved stone inscription in medieval Latin. Space resealed. Significance of inscription not determined. St. Martin, Wareham, Dorset. Underground chamber accessed during Victorian restoration, found to contain pre-Christian carved stone. Chamber resealed. Contents not fully documented. St. Cuthbert, Wells, Somerset. Sealed door in north wall of nave. Chess, recorded in 1743 as leading to the old passage. To the yard beneath the chancel, not opened since. The unnamed church in Lincolnshire. Underground passage of exceptional quality, descending beyond the point of the 1972 investigation. Not investigated since, and hundreds more. The doors are waiting. The dark is patient. The ground beneath Britain's oldest churches has been keeping its secrets for a very long time. It shows no sign of stopping. End Part 10. The Saints and Their Bones. The relationship between saints' relics and underground church spaces is one of the most important and least discussed aspects of the sealed door phenomenon. To understand it properly, you have to understand what a relic meant to a medieval Christian, and what a medieval Christian believed a relic could do. A relic was not a memento, and it was not a historical artifact in the modern sense, an object valuable because of its age or its associations with a significant person. A relic was, in medieval theological understanding, a fragment of a body that retained the spiritual potency of the saint to whom it had belonged. The saint was present in the relic. The relic was not merely a reminder of the saint. It was a point of contact with the saint, a location in the physical world where the boundary between the earthly and the heavenly was thinner than usual, where prayers offered were more likely to be heard, and where miraculous intervention was more likely to occur. This belief had enormous practical consequences. This pilgrimage was economically significant. The income generated by a church that held important relics could be substantial enough to fund major building campaigns. The competition between churches for the possession of significant relics was intense, sometimes openly commercial, sometimes involving what later periods would regard as straightforward theft. The translation of relics, the formal ceremonial movement of a saint's remains from one location to another, was one of the most significant events in the liturgical calendar, attracting enormous crowds and generating correspondingly enormous revenues. And relics were stored underground, not always and not exclusively. Important relics were often displayed above ground, in elaborate reliquaries of gold and precious stones, positioned on or behind the high altar, where pilgrims could see them and approach them. But the most significant relics, the ones considered most powerful, were typically housed in underground spaces beneath the altar, accessible only to the clergy and to specially privileged pilgrims. The logic was both theological and practical. Theologically, the underground space was continuous with the tradition of the catacombs, placing the relics in a context that connected them to the earliest Christian practice. Practically, underground storage protected relics from theft, from the elements, and from the everyday use of the church building above. A relic stored in an underground vault was physically secure in a way that a relic on display in the nave was not. The underground relic chambers of British churches were therefore among the most carefully maintained and frequently used underground spaces in any medieval building. They were not abandoned or neglected. They were opened regularly for the celebration of feasts, for the reception of important pilgrims, for the performance of specific ceremonies associated with the saint. The clergy who maintained them were familiar with their contents and their condition. The records of what was stored in them were kept with care, because the relics were valuable both spiritually and financially, and their management was a serious responsibility. When the Reformation came, the relic cult was among the first things to be attacked. Protestant reformers regarded relics as the most obvious expression of the Catholic tendency toward what they called superstition and idolatry. The veneration of saints' bodily remains was dismissed as a corruption of true religion. The relics themselves were, in many cases, physically destroyed, burned, dissolved in acid, scattered. The commissioner appointed to close the monasteries under Henry VIII included in their briefs the destruction of images and relics, and this destruction was carried out with varying degrees of thoroughness, depending on the commissioner and the location. But not all relics were destroyed. In some churches, the clergy hid their relics before the commissioners arrived. In others, the relics were moved to private homes for safekeeping. In others still, the relics were placed back in their underground vaults, and the vault was sealed, on the calculation that what the commissioners could not find, they could not destroy. This calculation was, in a significant number of cases, correct. The relics of several important British saints are documented as having been hidden during the Reformation and subsequently lost from the record. The relics of St. Cuthbert, the most important saint of the north of England, were concealed during the dissolution of Durham Cathedral Priory and only rediscovered in 1827, when structural work on the cathedral exposed a concealed tomb containing the saint's remains in a state of exceptional preservation, wrapped in silk vestments and accompanied by a number of other objects, including an ivory comb and a small portable altar. The Cuthbert case is famous because the rediscovery was documented and the remains were subsequently examined and reinterred. But there are other cases, less famous, where the hiding of relics during the Reformation is documented, but the subsequent finding is not. In other words, there are underground spaces beneath British churches that were sealed during the 16th century, specifically to protect their contents from destruction, and whose contents have never been recovered. The relics are still there. The sealed vault is still sealed. The door is closed, and what is on the other side of the door is precisely what was put there almost 500 years ago. How many such cases exist is unknown. The documentary evidence that would allow us to identify them, the records of relic collections and their hiding places, was itself often destroyed or lost during the upheavals of the Reformation period. But the physical evidence is there, in the form of sealed doorways in the walls of churches that were known to have held important relic collections before the Reformation, and that have no documented record of those relics being destroyed or removed. The Hermit and the Hole. There is a dimension to the underground spaces of Britain's churches that is both intimate and almost entirely forgotten, and it concerns a class of religious practitioner who was never as famous as the anchorite, but who was, for several centuries, far more numerous. The hermit. Medieval Britain had a substantial population of hermits, religious men and women who had withdrawn from ordinary social life to live in solitude and prayer. Unlike anchorites, who were permanently enclosed in fixed cells, hermits retained a degree of mobility and could, in principle, live anywhere that offered sufficient isolation and sufficient access to basic necessities. In practice, many hermits lived in close association with specific places considered sacred, including churches, and many of those hermits lived underground. The underground cells associated with hermits are distinct from anchorite cells and from charnel houses and from relic vaults. They tend to be larger, more irregular in shape, and less carefully finished. They are cut or assembled rather than precisely constructed. They reflect the needs of a single person, living in relative self-sufficiency, rather than the needs of a community performing formal liturgical functions. And hermit cells have been identified in the grounds and walls of British churches across the country, mostly through chance discovery during renovation or agricultural work. They tend to appear as single rooms, roughly circular or oval in shape, with a low ceiling, a simple niche or shelf cut into the wall, and evidence of habitation that may extend over years or decades. Worn floors, soot deposits, the remains of crude furniture. Many of them have doors, and many of those doors are sealed. The sealed door of a hermit cell raises different questions from the sealed door of a charnel house or a relic vault. There is nothing necessarily valuable or historically significant behind it in the conventional sense. No bones of outstanding importance, no relics, no endowments. It is just the remnants of a life lived in deliberate simplicity in a small dark room, beneath or beside a church. But those remnants can be extraordinarily informative. A well-preserved hermit cell contains evidence of daily life at the margins of medieval society in a way that almost no other type of archaeological site can provide. The objects a hermit had with them, the food they ate, the tools they used, the texts they read, the devotional objects they kept, all of this constitutes primary evidence of a way of life that is otherwise almost invisible in the historical record. The most extensively documented medieval hermit cell in Britain is the Cave Hermitage at Warkworth, Northumberland, carved from the rock of a cliff face above the River Coquet. The Warkworth Hermitage is famous and well preserved. Maintained as a heritage site and accessible to visitors. It is the exception. Most hermit cells associated with British churches are not famous, not maintained, and not accessible. They are simply sealed and forgotten, their doors closed and their contents unknown. Part 11. The Language of Stone. There is a way of reading the stones of a medieval church that most modern visitors do not know, and that would tell them a great deal about what lies beneath their feet if they did. Medieval church builders communicated through their architecture in ways that were immediately legible to their contemporaries, but have become opaque to us. The placement of windows indicated the relative importance of the spaces they illuminated. The direction that doorways faced indicated the nature of the spaces they gave access to. The height of thresholds indicated whether a space was designed for the quick transit of many people or the slow, deliberate entry of few. The doors leading to underground spaces in medieval churches follow consistent conventions that allow them to be identified even when their function is not documented. They are typically lower than doors leading to above-ground spaces, requiring a slight ducking of the head on entry, a physical acknowledgement of the transition from the ordinary world to the space below. They are typically narrower than the main doors of the church, reflecting the intimate and restricted nature of the access they provided, and they are typically located in the north wall or in the floor of the nave or chancel, reflecting the directional conventions already discussed. These physical characteristics mean that a trained eye can identify the former location of a sealed underground door, even when the door itself has been completely removed and the opening bricked over or plastered. The proportions of the blocked opening, its height relative to the floor level, its position in the wall, and the character of the masonry around it all speak to its original function in ways that the builders of the blocking sometimes obscure but rarely entirely erase. This kind of architectural reading has been applied systematically to only a small number of British churches. It has been applied, in a less systematic way, by generations of architectural historians and church guides who noticed unusual features in the walls of churches they were studying or visiting without necessarily understanding what those features indicated. The result is a scattered literature of observations that has never been consolidated into a comprehensive picture. Within that scattered literature are references to sealed openings in the north walls of churches all across Britain, in numbers that suggest the phenomenon is not rare but genuinely widespread. A survey of published church guides for a single English county, chosen at random, reveals references to sealed or blocked features that correspond to the characteristics of underground access doors in 7 of the 23 churches included in the sample. 7 out of 23, in one county, and from a sample that is far from exhaustive. If that proportion is representative, and there is no particular reason to think the chosen county is atypical, then the number of sealed underground access doors currently present in British churches, numbers not in the dozens, but in the thousands. The acoustic tradition. There is one more aspect of underground church spaces that deserves attention, and it is the aspect that most directly connects the physical architecture to the liturgical practice of the communities that built and used these spaces. Sound. Underground spaces have distinctive acoustic properties. The enclosed stone walls and low ceilings of a typical underground church chamber produce a reverberant quality that is quite different from the acoustic of the church above. Sound decays more slowly. If frequencies in certain ranges are amplified, the human voice, or the sound of a bell, or the sound of a choir, behaves differently underground than it does at ground level. Medieval liturgical practice was acutely sensitive to acoustic environments. The chanting of the divine office, the daily cycle of prayers that was the central activity of monastic and cathedral communities, was designed to be performed in spaces with specific acoustic properties. Different types of prayer were assigned to different physical spaces, partly on theological grounds and partly on acoustic ones. The resonant quality of a stone vault enhanced certain types of chant in ways that were understood and exploited by medieval musicians and architects. The underground spaces beneath medieval churches were not acoustically dead. They were acoustically active and in ways that were recognized and used. Certain types of prayer, certain types of ceremony, certain types of musical performance were assigned to underground spaces precisely because the acoustic environment enhanced their effect. The underground relic vault beneath a medieval cathedral was not just a safe place to store relics. It was a place where the resonant quality of the stone amplified the prayers offered there in ways that the faithful experienced as evidence of the sacred potency of the space. When those spaces were sealed, their acoustic properties were sealed with them. The reverberant chambers beneath Britain's ancient churches continue to exist, their stone walls continuing to transmit sound in the ways that medieval builders designed them to do, but without anyone in them to experience the effect. Unless, of course, and sound travels in both directions. The consistent reports of sounds emanating from behind sealed underground doors, already discussed in an earlier section, take on a slightly different quality in this context. If the underground chambers of medieval churches were designed as acoustically active spaces, and if those spaces remain acoustically active even when sealed, then it is at least theoretically possible that vibrations introduced into the underground space from outside it, by passing traffic, by seismic activity, by the resonant vibration of the church building itself, could produce sounds audible in the church above at the location of the sealed door. This is not a supernatural explanation, it is a physical one. But it suggests that the sounds people report hearing from behind sealed doors may be genuine acoustic phenomena, reflecting the physical properties of the sealed spaces, rather than either imagination or something more difficult to explain. The medieval builders would have understood this. They understood that the sealed door was also an acoustic membrane, that what was behind it was not simply silent, that the underground space continued to speak in its own way through the stone. Part 12. What the clergy know and do not say. There is a final dimension to the story of Britain's sealed underground church spaces that is harder to document but important to acknowledge. It is the dimension of institutional knowledge, of what the clergy who have served in ancient churches have known or suspected, and or been told in confidence by their predecessors. The Church of England maintains a large number of very old buildings. Many of those buildings have been in continuous use as places of worship for centuries, their clergy serving in an unbroken succession that extends back through Victorian vicars to Georgian rectors to Tudor incumbents. The institutional memory of a church in continuous use is long, and it is not always written down. Clergy who have served in ancient churches often know things about their buildings that do not appear in any written record. They know about the door that their predecessor told them not to open. They know about the section of floor that sounds hollow when you walk on it. They know about the investigation that was conducted in the 1950s by a previous incumbent who found something in the North Transept and then said very little about it publicly and sealed it back up immediately. They know about the entry in the vestry records that refers to the lower chamber and the instruction to keep it locked. This knowledge is transmitted informally, from one incumbent to the next, with varying degrees of detail and clarity. It is not available to the public. It is not required to be disclosed to heritage bodies. It is the private institutional memory of a very old institution, held by individuals who may or may not choose to act on it, and who are under no legal obligation to do so. And the result is a situation where the people with the best knowledge of what lies behind the sealed doors of Britain's churches are precisely the people least likely to share that knowledge publicly, and least subject to external pressure to do so. This is not necessarily sinister. The Church of England has legitimate interests in managing information about its buildings carefully, particularly information that might attract unwanted attention or disturb vulnerable sites. A sealed underground space that contains human remains is not something that the church responsible for it is required to advertise. But it does mean that the public record of sealed underground church spaces is systematically incomplete in a particular way. The gap between what is publicly known and what is privately known within the institutions responsible for these buildings may be substantial. The institutional memory of the Church of England is, in this respect, a private archive of secrets about the underground geography of Britain's most ancient buildings, held by an institution that has little incentive to open that archive to public scrutiny. Whether that archive will ever be opened in full is an open question. It depends on individual decisions made by individual clergy and church authorities across hundreds of parishes and thousands of years of accumulated knowledge. It depends on legal frameworks that do not currently require disclosure of what lies beneath church buildings. And it depends on a cultural willingness to confront what is underground, to take seriously the possibility that the sealed doors of Britain's churches are not minor architectural curiosities, but significant historical evidence about the deepest layers of this island's sacred past. The doors are still sealed. The knowledge of what lies behind them is still private. The ground beneath Britain's ancient churches still holds its secrets. But the ground-penetrating radar keeps working. The researchers keep looking. The architectural historians keep reading the stones. And every so often, somewhere in Britain, a section of plaster falls away from a church wall, or a floor becomes unstable and is lifted, or a builder, drilling for a pipe, hits an unexpected void. And someone goes to look, and comes back knowing something they did not know before. The underground history of Britain is not closed, it is ongoing. It is happening now, in real time, in the churches of a country that has been building on the same sacred ground for 1500 years, over the bones of all the generations that came before. The sealed doors are an invitation. They are an invitation to ask what we do not yet know about the place we live in, and about the people who lived here before us, and about the relationship between the living and the dead that has been the central concern of human beings on this island since before history began. It is an invitation that Britain has mostly declined. For now, the Wells door revisited return, one last time, to St. Cuthbert's in Wells. The door in the north wall of the nave, the black wood, the rusted iron ring, the single entry in the vestry records from 1743, in them noting that it had been sealed against the damp and the smell. Stand in front of that door and consider what it represents. It represents 1500 years of continuous, sacred use on a single piece of Somerset ground. It represents the accumulated decisions of generations of clergy and parishioners about what to remember and what to forget, what to keep and what to discard, what to open and what to seal. It represents a theology of the dead that has been almost entirely lost from living practice, but that shaped the physical fabric of this building in ways that are still visible if you know how to look. And it represents a question that this island has been asking, in one form or another, since the first Christian missionaries arrived and found that the ground they were standing on was already sacred. What do you do with the dead? Do you keep them close, minister to them, maintain a relationship with them that persists beyond physical death? Do you build your most important buildings over their remains and open doors to them regularly, maintaining the connection between the living community and the community of the dead? Or do you seal the door, plaster over the opening, and walk away? Britain has given different answers to this question at different times in its history. The sealed doors are the record of all those different answers, layered on top of each other in the stone of ancient buildings. The door in the north wall of the nave at St. Cuthbert's in Wells is sealed. It has been sealed for 300 years. The damp and the smell are presumably long gone. What remains on the other side of that door is a space that was important enough to build, important enough to use, important enough to seal carefully when it was no longer needed. What it contains is the question that nobody, in 300 years, has thought it urgent enough to answer. The answer is still there, waiting, in the dark, behind the door. End of document part 13. The geography of sacred ground. To properly understand why underground spaces appear so consistently beneath Britain's oldest churches, you need to understand the concept that medieval scholars called locus sacra, the sacred place. And to understand the sacred place, you need to understand that medieval Christianity, for all its theological distinctiveness, was built on top of something much older. The sites of Britain's oldest churches were not chosen arbitrarily. They were chosen, in the overwhelming majority of cases, because they were already sacred ground. The communities that built them were converting to a new religion, not abandoning a deep and long-standing relationship with specific pieces of landscape. Britain's pre-Christian sacred sites were marked in various ways. Some were marked by monuments, the henges, stone circles, long barrows, and hill forts that are the most visible evidence of pre-Christian sacred practice. Some were marked by natural features, springs, rivers, hilltops, groves of particular trees. Some were marked simply by accumulated use, by the fact that people had gathered in the same spot for generation upon generation until the gathered memories of those gatherings made the place feel different from the ordinary landscape around it. When Christian missionaries chose sites for their churches, they chose these places. As not always, and not exclusively, but consistently enough that it constitutes a pattern rather than a coincidence. The early medieval church had a deliberate policy, articulated clearly in a letter from Pope Gregory the Great to the missionary Augustine in 601 CE, of adopting and Christianizing pre-existing sacred sites rather than destroying them. Gregory's letter is explicit. Do not pull down the temples of the idols, but destroy the idols, purify the buildings with holy water, set up altars, and place relics in them. The people should not have to change their places of resort, only their objects of worship. This policy had a direct physical consequence. The places where Britain's earliest churches were built were places where the ground was already significant, already marked, already understood to be different from the surrounding landscape. And in many cases, those places were already marked by what was underground rather than what was above it. Pre-Christian Britain used underground spaces for sacred purposes extensively. The long barrows of the Neolithic period, the earliest monumental sacred architecture in Britain, were primarily underground structures, chambers cut from the chalk or built from stone and then covered with earth, used for the burial of the dead over periods of centuries. The earliest examples of these structures predate the construction of Stonehenge by 1,000 years. They represent an understanding of the relationship between sacred space and the underground that is at least 6,000 years old on this island. The Iron Age communities that immediately preceded the Roman arrival in Britain continued and elaborated this tradition. Iron Age sacred sites often included underground shafts and chambers, some of which were clearly used for ritual purposes, containing carefully deposited objects, animal bones, and sometimes human remains. The votive deposit of objects in water, another form of underground sacred practice, was widespread across Britain throughout the Iron Age and persisted well into the Roman period. When Roman culture arrived in Britain, it brought its own underground sacred traditions. Roman temples were frequently built with underground chambers, the crypta under the cellar, which served as storage for sacred objects and as spaces for specific types of ritual. Roman domestic religion included the veneration of the lares and household spirits of the dead in household shrines that were often located in the lower levels of the building, closest to the ground. When Christianity spread through Roman Britain and then, after the withdrawal of Roman administration, through the successor kingdoms, it inherited all of this accumulated underground sacred tradition. The underground spaces beneath Britain's medieval churches are not simply the product of Christian theological ideas about the relationship between the living and the dead. They are the latest layer of a tradition that goes back to the earliest human occupation of this island. The sealed doors are therefore not merely medieval, they are the visible entry points to a vertical archaeology that, in the most favourable cases, and extends down through 6,000 years of human sacred practice on a single piece of ground. The water beneath. There is one more physical characteristic of the underground spaces beneath Britain's ancient churches that has received almost no systematic attention, and it connects the Christian tradition of sacred underground space to an even older tradition that preceded it by thousands of years. Water. The relationship between sacred sites and water is one of the most consistent features of British pre-Christian religious practice. The votive deposits of the Iron Age, the objects deliberately thrown into rivers, lakes, and bogs as offerings to supernatural powers, represent one of the most extensively documented forms of pre-Christian British religion. The wells and springs associated with healing and prophecy were so significant that many of them survived the Christianization of Britain by simply being rededicated to Christian saints rather than abandoned. This relationship between sacred space and water did not disappear when Christianity arrived. It was incorporated into Christian practice, somewhat uneasily, and the result is visible in the physical fabric of Britain's ancient churches. Many of Britain's oldest churches are sited near or directly above springs. Wells Cathedral, already mentioned in relation to St. Cuthbert's, takes its name from a series of springs that rise from the limestone bedrock near the cathedral's site. The springs were considered sacred long before the cathedral was built. They continue to flow today, feeding the moat of the adjacent Bishop's Palace. And they may have been a primary reason for the choice of this particular site for one of England's greater medieval cathedrals. Canterbury, where Augustine established the first archiepiscopal see in England, is also a site of ancient springs. The River Stour, which flows through Canterbury, was associated with pre-Christian sacred practice in the Iron Age, and several of the springs that feed it rise within or near the cathedral precinct. St Winfried's Well in Holywell, Flintshire, is the most famous surviving example of a sacred well in Britain, one that has been in continuous use as a pilgrimage site from at least the medieval period, and possibly much longer. The well is enclosed within a late medieval chapel, and the underground chamber containing the well is one of the few surviving examples of this architectural type. But St Winifred's is the exception. Most of the sacred wells and springs that once played a role in British religious life are now forgotten, or remembered only in the names of the parishes and churches associated with them. The springs that flow beneath many of Britain's oldest churches continue to flow, often feeding the drainage problems that have troubled church authorities for centuries, without anyone recognizing them as the ancient sacred features that they are. And the underground spaces of those churches, the sealed chambers and passages and vaulted rooms, were in many cases built in specific relationship to those springs. The drainage channels found in some underground church chambers are not simply practical water management features. They are the survival, in Christianized form, and of a much older practice of channeling and venerating the water that rose from the sacred ground. The sealed doors, in these cases, lead not just to bones and relics and the remnants of forgotten liturgical practice. They lead to water, to the living springs that have been flowing from the same spots in the same ground for thousands of years. Water that was sacred before it was Christian, and that has remained sacred, in its own way, regardless of what ceremonies were performed above it. The medieval priests who maintained the underground spaces of their churches understood this, in a way that their successors who sealed the doors did not. They understood that the ground beneath their buildings was not simply soil and rock, but a living landscape. A landscape that had been in relationship with the human communities above it for longer than any Christian theology could account for. When they opened the doors, they opened them into that landscape. They went down into it regularly. They maintained their relationship with it as part of their pastoral and liturgical responsibilities. When the Reformation came and the doors were sealed, that relationship was severed. The underground landscape continued to exist. The springs continued to flow. The bones continued to lie in their vaults. The water continued to move through its channels. But the human beings above ground stopped going down to meet it. The result is the situation we have today, a living underground landscape connected to the surface by sealed doors, waiting for someone to turn the iron ring and pull. Part 14. The Long Return. There are signs, in recent years, that Britain's relationship with its underground church spaces may be slowly changing. The increase in ground-penetrating radar surveys of ancient churches reflects a genuine and growing interest in understanding what lies beneath these buildings. The surveys are being commissioned partly by churches themselves, anxious to understand the condition of the ground beneath their structures before undertaking renovation work, and partly by archaeological organisations seeking to build a more complete picture of Britain's underground heritage. The results of these surveys are being published, slowly and incompletely, in specialist journals and heritage reports. They are being read by an audience that includes not just professional archaeologists and heritage managers, but a growing community of interested members of the public who have developed a serious engagement with the archaeology of sacred sites. There is also a growing awareness within the Church of England itself of the historical and cultural significance of the underground spaces beneath its buildings. The Church is the custodian of some of the most significant heritage in Britain, including heritage that lies beneath as well as above ground, and there is increasing recognition within the institution that custodianship implies not just maintenance, but understanding. The Heritage Lottery Fund, which has provided funding for church conservation projects across Britain for several decades, has in recent years begun funding projects that include the investigation of underground spaces as part of broader conservation programs. This funding is modest and the coverage is patchy, but it represents a shift from a position where underground spaces were simply sealed and forgotten to one where their investigation is considered a legitimate and fundable activity. Individual researchers have made significant contributions to the understanding of specific underground spaces in specific churches. The work of individual architectural historians, archaeologists, and local historians has produced a scattered but cumulatively substantial literature on particular sealed spaces and their histories. But the overall picture remains one of systematic underinvestigation. The number of surveys and investigations that have been conducted is small compared to the number of sealed spaces that are known to exist. The number of known spaces is certainly small compared to the number that actually exist, many of which have not yet been identified by any survey or investigation. The long return to Britain's underground sacred landscape, if it is happening at all, is happening very slowly. It will take generations of sustained effort, substantial funding, and a genuine cultural shift in attitudes toward the underground heritage of ancient religious sites before anything approaching a comprehensive picture becomes available. In the meantime, the doors remain sealed. The dark remains undisturbed. The bones and the relics and the water and the ancient stone remain where they have been for centuries. Centuries in some cases, millennia in others, waiting. Britain is a crowded island with a very long memory. Most of that memory lives above ground in the documents and buildings and landscapes that are visible and accessible and well studied. But some of it lives underground, in the sealed spaces beneath the most ancient buildings in the land, in the darkness behind the doors that nobody opens. The underground memory of Britain is not a minor footnote to its history. It is the foundation of that history, literally and figuratively. It is the place where the oldest relationships between human communities and sacred ground were established and maintained. It is the place where the deepest continuities of British religious practice survive, sealed away from the light but intact. It is preserved by the very act of closure that was intended to end them. The sealed doors of Britain's churches are not endings. They are pauses. Very long pauses, in some cases. Pauses that have lasted 300 years, 500 years, 1,000 years. But pauses nonetheless. The ground beneath Britain's ancient churches is waiting to be read. The stone is waiting to speak. The water is waiting to be seen. And somewhere in Britain, right now, there is someone standing in front of a sealed door in the north wall of an ancient church, looking at the black wood and the rusted iron ring and the lime mortar seal, and wondering, just wondering, what is on the other side? How long has it been there? And what it would mean for everything we think we know about this island if we opened it. The door is sealed, for now. It says end part 15. The churches of the north. The northern counties of England present a different underground landscape from the south, one shaped by different geology, different history, and a different relationship between Christian practice and pre-Christian tradition. In Yorkshire, Northumberland, Cumbria, and Durham, the persistence of Celtic Christian traditions, long after the Roman Church had established dominance in the south, produced a distinctive architectural culture in which the boundary between the sacred underground and the sacred above ground was managed in ways that have no precise equivalent in the southern counties. The Celtic Church, which developed in Ireland and Scotland and spread into northern Britain through the missionary activity of figures including Columba, Aidan, and Cuthbert, may had a particular relationship with sacred landscape that differed from the Roman tradition in important ways. where the Roman tradition tended to establish formal sacred spaces, buildings, and enclosures that defined the boundary between sacred and ordinary. The Celtic tradition was more comfortable with sacred space that extended outward into the landscape, rather than being contained within constructed boundaries. Holy wells, sacred hills, particular rivers and trees, all featured in Celtic Christian practice as sacred locations that required no building to mark them as significant. But the Celtic tradition also had its underground spaces. The souterrain, an underground passage built for storage and refuge, was a feature of Iron Age and early medieval settlement in Ireland, Scotland, and parts of northern Britain, and several souterrains have been found in association with early Christian sites. The relationship between these storage passages and the sacred practice of the communities that built them is not entirely clear, but several early Christian sites in northern Britain include what appear to be souterrains that were incorporated into the liturgical life of the community in some way, perhaps as places of retreat, perhaps as locations for the storage of sacred objects, perhaps simply as underground spaces whose existence in a sacred setting gave them a spiritual resonance that purely practical structures would not have had. The Church of St. Paul at Jarrow, Northumberland, where the Venerable Bede spent most of his adult life in the late 7th and early 8th centuries, is built over ground that has been associated with Christian practice since the earliest period of the Northumbrian Church. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of the site have identified anomalies beneath the nave that are consistent with earlier structural phases, possibly including underground spaces associated with the original monastic community. Jarrow is one of the most studied early Christian sites in Britain, but its underground spaces, if they exist, have not been physically investigated. Whitby Abbey, also in Yorkshire, the site of the famous Synod of Whitby in 664 CE, at which the Celtic and Roman factions of the British Church agreed on the date of Easter and thereby resolved one of the most significant internal disputes of early British Christianity, stands on a clifftop site with a long history of sacred association. The site is ruined now, the victim of Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries, but its archaeological complexity extends well below ground level. Excavations conducted in the 19th century and again in the 20th century have identified successive phases of building, going back to the earliest period of the site's Christian use, and have hinted at underground spaces that the excavations did not fully explore. The ruined abbeys of northern England, the great Cistercian and Benedictine foundations at Rievaulx, Fountains, Byland, and Bolton all share a characteristic that their more famous above-ground architecture sometimes obscures. They were built on sites that had been sacred before the monks arrived, and their underground spaces reflect that pre-existing sacredness as much as the formal requirements of monastic liturgical life. Rievaulx Abbey, whose ruined nave and chancel constitute one of the most beautiful architectural survivals in Britain, was founded in 1132 on a site in the valley of the River Rye that appears to have been associated with pre-Christian practice. The monks who founded the abbey described the site as a place of horror and vast solitude, a description that sounds rhetorical but may reflect a genuine awareness that they were settling a place with a complex pre-existing history. The abbey's crypt, which survives in part beneath the east end of the ruined church, has never been fully investigated. The ground surveys have identified anomalies beyond the boundaries of the excavated crypt that may represent earlier phases of underground construction. Fountains Abbey, near Ripon, is the best preserved of the great Yorkshire Cistercian foundations and one of the most visited heritage sites in Britain. Its underground spaces are among the most extensive of any medieval building in the country. The Lay Brothers Undercroft alone is a vast vaulted hall stretching the full length of the Western Range. But less well known are the smaller underground spaces associated with the Infirmary Range, including a series of rooms and passages that were apparently used for specific liturgical purposes, and that show evidence of multiple phases of construction and use extending over the abbey's 4-century history. When Fountains was dissolved in 1539, and its above-ground buildings were systematically stripped of anything of value and then left to decay. Its underground spaces were sealed and forgotten, along with everything else. What they contain, whether the monks hid significant objects in their underground spaces before the commissioners arrived as the monks of Durham hid St. Cuthbert's relics, is not known. The Northern Hermit tradition. The northern counties of England had a particularly strong tradition of hermit life, one that was sustained long after the practice had declined in the south, and that produced a remarkable series of underground sacred spaces whose distribution maps closely onto the distribution of sealed doors in northern churches. The hermit tradition of the north drew on both the Celtic and the Roman streams of British Christianity. From the Celtic tradition, it drew an understanding of sacred landscape that valued wild and remote places as sites of particular spiritual intensity. From the Roman tradition, it drew the specific practices of solitary prayer, fasting, and physical austerity that characterized the great desert fathers of Egypt and Syria, whose example was transmitted to northern Britain through texts and through the influence of continental monasticism. The result was a tradition of northern hermits who sought out specifically underground locations for their retreats. Not always cellars or excavated chambers, though those occur too. Often natural caves, of which the limestone landscape of the northern Pennines and the sandstone landscape of the Yorkshire coast provided a substantial supply. The caves associated with Christian hermits in northern Britain range from fully natural formations to substantially modified structures where the natural cave has been extended, divided, and furnished with features appropriate to sustained habitation and regular liturgical practice. Several of these cave hermitages are associated with later parish churches that were built near them, sometimes incorporating the cave into the fabric of the church building, and sometimes simply acknowledging the cave as a sacred site while building the formal church structure at a short distance from it. The Church of St. Robert at Knaresborough, North Yorkshire, is built adjacent to the cave that the 12th century hermit Robert of Knaresborough used as his retreat for much of his adult life. The cave is still accessible and has been a site of pilgrimage since Robert's death in 1218. But St. Robert's Cave is the exception. The famous case with a documented history and a maintained physical presence. The unnamed caves associated with forgotten hermits in the hills and valleys of northern England are far more numerous and far less well preserved. Many of them are now inaccessible, their entrances collapsed or overgrown. Others have been incorporated into farm buildings or have been sealed by landowners who wanted to prevent access. Some are on church lands and are theoretically accessible, but the church authorities responsible for them may not know they exist, or may know they exist, but have no resources to investigate or maintain them. In some northern churches, the connection to a nearby cave hermitage is preserved in the physical fabric of the building in the form of a sealed door that originally provided internal access from the church to the cave. The cave was the original sacred space. The church was built to provide a more formal setting for community worship at the same site, and the door connecting them remained open, providing clergy with access to the older, less formal sacred space that predated the church above. When the hermit tradition declined, when the post-Reformation church had no use for semi-formal solitary practitioners living in adjacent caves, the connecting doors were sealed. The caves continued to exist, attached to church buildings by walls of stone and mortar. The sealed doors marked the boundary between the two, the formal church space that continued to be used, and the older sacred space that was no longer formally acknowledged. These sealed doors are among the most historically significant in Britain, precisely because of what lies on the other side of them. Not a charnel house or a relic vault, but a natural cave, modified for human habitation, that preserves in its physical fabric the evidence of a form of sacred practice, going back in some cases to before the Norman conquest. A practice that connected Christian devotion to the pre-Christian sacred landscape of the north of England in ways that neither the Catholic nor the Protestant Church ever entirely sanctioned or entirely eliminated. Part 16. The Irish Connection. Britain's underground church spaces cannot be fully understood without reference to Ireland, as where a parallel tradition of underground sacred spaces developed independently but with close connections to the British tradition. Ireland was never part of the Roman Empire, and Irish Christianity developed without the Roman architectural inheritance that shaped the earliest churches in Britain. But Ireland had its own deep tradition of underground sacred spaces, rooted in the same pre-Christian relationship between the sacred and the underground that characterized the broader Celtic world. Irish passage tombs, the great Neolithic structures at Newgrange, Knowth, and Douth in the Boyne Valley are among the most sophisticated and most extensively studied underground sacred spaces in the British Isles. They predate Christianity by several thousand years, but they were not abandoned or forgotten when Christianity arrived in Ireland. They were incorporated into the Christian sacred landscape, renamed, rededicated, and used as reference points for a Christian understanding of the sacred that was willing to acknowledge the spiritual significance of very old places, even when their original religious context was no longer available. Irish monastic tradition, which was the primary vehicle of Christian practice in Ireland from the 5th century to the 12th, had its own distinctive relationship with underground spaces. Irish monasteries typically included among their structures a small underground cell called a souterrain, the same word used for the underground passages of Iron Age settlements. These monastic souterrains were used for storage, as they were in secular settlements. But they also appear to have had a liturgical dimension, being used for certain types of prayer and retreat in ways that paralleled the crypt tradition of continental monasticism. When Irish monks crossed to Britain and established monasteries in the Scottish Islands, in Northumbria, and in other parts of northern Britain, they brought this tradition with them. The monastery on Iona, founded by Columba in 563 CE, appears to have included underground spaces that have not been fully investigated. The site of Columba's original church on Iona is known to be underground, having been deliberately built below the surface of the ground rather than above it, in a tradition that has parallels in early Christian practice in the Middle East, but that may also reflect specifically Celtic attitudes toward underground sacred space. The connections between Irish and British underground sacred traditions in the early medieval period are documented incompletely, but suggestively. Several of the underground spaces beneath northern British churches show architectural features that have closer parallels in Irish ecclesiastical architecture than in the English or continental traditions. This suggests that the underground sacred landscape of northern Britain was shaped by Irish influence as much as by Roman influence, and that the full story of these spaces requires attention to both streams. The sealed doors of northern British churches may therefore lead not just to English medieval charnel houses and English Reformation-era relic vaults, but to spaces that reflect a fusion of Irish and Roman and pre-Christian traditions that is specific to this island and to the particular historical moment when those traditions met and merged. That fusion is one of the most interesting and least studied aspects of British religious history, and much of the physical evidence for it may still be intact behind the sealed doors in the dark. Part 17. Listening to the ground. There is a method used by archaeologists and building surveyors to investigate underground spaces without physical access. A method that has been around for decades, but that is only recently being applied systematically to church sites. It is called acoustic sounding, and its results are sometimes surprising. Acoustic sounding involves generating sound waves at the surface. Also, usually by tapping the floor or wall with a standardized tool and then analyzing the way those sound waves propagate through the underlying material. A solid mass of earth or stone produces a characteristic response. A void, an underground space with air in it, produces a quite different response. With sufficient sensitivity in the measuring equipment and sufficient skill in the interpretation, acoustic sounding can detect underground voids with reasonable reliability and can give some indication of their size and depth. The method has been used in structural surveys of old buildings for practical purposes, to detect cavities that might compromise the stability of foundations. It has been used in archaeology to investigate sites where excavation is not possible, to get a first indication of what might be underground before committing to the expense and disruption of digging. It has occasionally been used in churches, with results that have added to the inventory of known or suspected underground spaces. But it has not been used systematically. There has been no national programme of acoustic survey of ancient British churches, no coordinated effort to use available non-invasive methods to build a comprehensive picture of what lies beneath the floors and within the walls of these buildings. The tools exist. The method is relatively inexpensive. The buildings are not going anywhere. The main thing that has prevented systematic acoustic survey of Britain's ancient churches from happening is not technical or financial, but organizational and motivational. It requires someone to decide that this is worth doing and to organize the necessary cooperation between church authorities, heritage bodies, and surveyors. That decision has not been made at a national level. Individual projects have been carried out by individual researchers with varying degrees of institutional support. The results have been published in specialist journals, presented at archaeological conferences, and largely ignored by the wider public and by the policy-making bodies responsible for Britain's heritage. This is partly a function of institutional priorities. Historic England, the Church of England's advisory bodies, and the local authorities responsible for listed buildings all have priorities that do not currently include systematic survey of underground church spaces. These institutions are chronically underfunded and operating under legal frameworks that were designed primarily to protect above-ground heritage and working with stakeholders, the churches themselves, who have complex and sometimes conflicting interests in what might be found underground. But it is also, in part, a function of cultural attitude. British heritage culture has a strong tendency to prioritize what can be seen over what cannot. The restoration of a medieval stained glass window, the conservation of a carved stone capital, the repair of a decaying roof. These are activities that produce visible results and attract public appreciation. The investigation of an underground space produces results that are invisible to the casual visitor, that require specialist interpretation to be understood, and that may not yield dramatic findings. The spectacular exceptions to this rule, as been cases like the discovery of Richard III beneath a Leicester car park in 2012, demonstrate what systematic investigation of underground spaces associated with known historical sites can produce. That discovery was made possible by a combination of academic research, public engagement, and institutional cooperation. That is not routine in British heritage practice, but that shows what is possible when those elements come together. The sealed underground spaces of Britain's ancient churches represent a similar, potentially much larger opportunity. They are not car parks. They are buildings that have been in continuous use as sacred spaces for up to 1,500 years. The ground beneath them has been significant to human communities for the entire period of the Christian era and for thousands of years before that. What lies within the sealed spaces of those buildings may be, in some cases, the most significant historical evidence available for the deepest layers of British cultural history. The opportunity to investigate that evidence is not unlimited. Time, water, structural instability, and biological activity are all working to degrade the contents of those sealed spaces. The window for investigation is not closing quickly. in most cases, but it is not standing still. The question of whether Britain will invest the effort and resources required to investigate its underground church heritage in a systematic and serious way is one that this generation has the opportunity to answer. The answer will determine what is still there to find when the next generation asks the same question. Oes coda, the iron ring. The iron ring on the door in the north wall of the nave at St. Cuthbert's in Wells is approximately 2 inches in diameter. It is made of wrought iron, forged by a blacksmith who died before the Great Fire of London, before the English Civil War, before Shakespeare was born. The iron is pitted with rust. The surface has the particular texture of very old iron, not smooth, not uniform, the texture of a material that has been in existence long enough to develop a character of its own. If you closed your hand around that ring and pulled, nothing would happen. The door has been sealed for 300 years. The mortar that holds it shut has been hardened by centuries of damp and drying. The wood around the ring has swollen and contracted so many times that the entire structure is essentially fused to the surrounding stonework. It would take tools to open it, professional help, institutional permission, a decision made by people with the authority to make it. But the ring is still there. That is the thing. In 300 years of services and festivals and ordinary Sundays and extraordinary events, of congregations who sat in the pews and never thought about what was in the north wall, of clergy who opened the vestry and lit the candles and gave the sermons and went home. In all of that time, nobody took the ring off. It is a small detail, but it is a telling one. The ring is an invitation. It has always been an invitation. The people who sealed the door left the ring. They left the means of opening it. Whatever their reasons for sealing the door, whatever they wanted to keep in, or keep out, or simply stop thinking about, they did not eliminate the possibility of return. The sealed doors of Britain's churches are all like that. They have been sealed with lime mortar and rubble and Victorian brickwork and plaster painted to match the surrounding walls. But the doors are still there, the rings are still there, or the spaces where the rings used to be. The openings can be reopened, the spaces can be entered, the questions can be asked. The underground history of Britain is sealed but not destroyed. It is waiting. It has been waiting for a very long time. It is, by any measure, astonishingly patient. The ground beneath Britain's oldest churches holds its secrets, not because it is incapable of giving them up, but because no one has yet thought it urgent enough to ask for them properly. Somewhere in Britain tonight, the sealed door in the north wall of a church is sitting in the dark of a building that has been locked up since evensong. The last of the light has faded from the windows. The building is quiet in the way that very old stone buildings are quiet. A quiet that is not absence of sound, but a very particular kind of presence. The accumulated silence of centuries of the same silence in the same space. And behind the sealed door, something that has been there for a very long time is simply continuing to be there, in the patient and absolute dark, exactly as it was when the door was sealed, exactly as it will be when, eventually, someone opens it. The question is not whether anyone will open it. The question is when. And what they will find when they do. Britain is full of sealed doors. Every one of them leads somewhere.